In December, Chicago doesn't just get cold, it becomes a landscape of survival. The skyscrapers of the Loop acted like wind tunnels, accelerating the freezing gusts until they felt like razors against exposed skin. On the 60th floor of the Sterling Grant Tower, the glass was triple-paned and silent. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive Fraser fur and the underlying metallic note of high-end catering. Arthur Sterling adjusted his cufflinks, his reflection in the dark window mocking him. He was a man who lived in numbers, but lately, the numbers felt empty. "Arthur, you're brooding again?" A sharp voice cut through his thoughts. It was Eleanor, his mother, draped in pearls that cost more than a mid-sized house. "Regina has been waiting by the caviar for 10 minutes. Her father just secured the Midwest trade lobby. Smile, for heaven's sake. This isn't a funeral. It's your future." "It feels like an auction, Mother," Arthur replied, his voice a low baritone. He looked at the room. 10 women, each a titan of industry or social standing, moved with practiced grace. They weren't there for the party. They were there for the merger of the Sterling name with their own. Meanwhile, 60 stories below, the reality of Chicago was far less polished. Sarah Miller pressed her back against the cold brick of a closed storefront. Her world had shrunk to the size of the cardboard box she sat on, and the heat radiating from her 5-year-old son, Leo. "Mommy, my ears hurt," Leo whispered. His breath came out in ragged puffs of white vapor. Sarah pulled her threadbare scarf from her own neck and wrapped it around his head. "I know, baby. Just a little longer. We'll find a place." She looked at her hands. They were cracked and gray from the cold. 2 years ago, those hands had typed legal briefs and held a steering wheel. Now, they held a sign that most people treated as invisible. She watched the sleek black SUVs pull up to the Sterling Grant Tower, disgorging people in furs and silks. They looked like creatures from another planet. "Why are they happy?" Leo asked, looking at the bright lights of the penthouse far above. "Because they're warm, Leo," Sarah said, her voice trembling not from sadness, but from the sheer physical effort of not shivering. Warmth makes everything look like happiness. She knew they couldn't stay on the corner. The police would be clearing the streets soon for the midnight patrols. She saw a service door near the back of the tower, left slightly ajar by a distracted delivery driver. It was a risk, but Leo's cough was getting worse. It sounded hollow, like an empty drum. "Come on," she whispered, grabbing their single plastic bag of belongings. "We're going inside." The transition from the street to the service hallway was jarring. The air was heavy with the smell of floor wax and industrial heating. To Sarah, it felt like a miracle. "Stay quiet," she cautioned Leo as they crept past stacks of folded linens and crates of champagne. They found a small alcove near a staff restroom. Sarah let Leo sit on a warm pipe. He closed his eyes, the sudden heat making him drowsy. "Who do we have here?" The voice was like a gunshot. A security guard, mid-50s with a face like granite, stood at the end of the hall. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. "You know you can't be here, ma'am. This is a high-security night." "Please," Sarah stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. "My son. He just needs to stop coughing. Just 10 minutes of heat. I'm not asking for money." "The boss is upstairs with the city's elite. If his mother sees a vagrant in the service wing, I lose my pension," the guard said, though his eyes softened as he looked at Leo's pale face. "Look, go through that door. It leads to the side of the main lobby. If you're quick and quiet, you can get out through the south exit before the night shift rotates. But you gotta move." Sarah nodded, dragging Leo toward the lobby. But as they entered the vast, marble-floored cathedral of the main entrance, the world slowed down. The elevator doors, the gold-plated ones reserved for the CFO, chimed. Arthur Sterling stepped out. He had walked away from the party, unable to stomach another conversation about tax loopholes. He wanted a cigar and the silence of the night. Instead, he found a woman who looked like she had been carved out of the very sidewalk he walked over every day. "Hold on," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the empty lobby. The security guards at the front desk immediately snapped to attention. "Mr. Sterling, we're sorry, sir." They slipped in through the back. We're removing them now. One guard reached for Sarah's arm. "Don't touch her," Arthur said. The command was quiet, but it carried the weight of a man used to being obeyed without question. He walked toward them. In the harsh LED lights of the lobby, Sarah looked even more battered. Her coat was a patchwork of thin materials, and her boots were held together by what looked like duct tape, but it was her eyes that stopped him. They weren't the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a soldier in a war she was losing. "What's your name?" Arthur asked. "Sarah Miller," she replied, her chin tilted up. "We were just leaving. We didn't steal anything." Arthur looked down at Leo, who was staring at Arthur's shiny leather shoes. "He's ill, isn't he?" "It's just a cold," Sarah lied. But Leo chose that moment to let out a hacking, painful cough that ended in a whimper. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp pang of disgust. Not for the woman, but for the party he had just left. Upstairs, they were debating which vintage of wine was too aggressive, while downstairs, a child was breathing liquid ice. "Bring them to the cafe in the mezzanine," Arthur ordered the guards. "Sir, your mother is expecting you back for the toast with Regina," the head of security reminded him. "Tell my mother," Arthur said, his gaze fixed on Sarah, "that I've found something more important than a toast." The mezzanine cafe was a glass-walled circle that overlooked the city. It was empty at this hour, the espresso machines gleaming under the soft amber lights. Arthur watched as Sarah sat Leo down on a plush velvet chair. She did it gently, as if she were afraid the chair would reject them. "Maria!" Arthur called out to a staff member clearing tables nearby. "Bring a pot of tea, some hot chocolate, and the heaviest soup the kitchen has left. Now." "You don't have to do this," Sarah said, her voice finally cracking. "We're used to the cold." "No one should be used to this." Arthur sat across from her. "You're articulate, Sarah. You don't speak like someone who has spent their life on the streets. What happened?" Sarah looked at the steam rising from the tea Maria placed in front of her. She wrapped her frozen fingers around the cup. "Life happened, Mr. Sterling. It's a lot faster than people think. I was a paralegal at a firm in River North. My husband David was a teacher. We had a life, a small one, but it was ours." She took a shaky breath. Then the accident happened. A pileup on the I-90. David didn't survive, and the medical bills for the 3 weeks he was in the ICU. The insurance found a pre-existing condition clause because of a heart murmur he had as a kid. They denied the claim. I sold the house. I sold the car. I thought I could work my way out of it, but without a home, you can't keep a job. Without a job, you can't get a home. It's a circle, and once you're in it, the world stops seeing you as a person. You just become clutter. Arthur listened in silence. He thought of the women upstairs. Regina, who had once cried because her private jet was delayed by an hour. Tiffany, who spent $30,000 on a handbag. "I spend my days looking at risk management charts," Arthur said quietly. "But I never considered that the greatest risk in this country is simply having a run of bad luck." Just then, the elevator doors hissed open. Regina walked out, followed by 2 other women from the party. They were laughing, clutching glasses of champagne, until they saw Arthur. "Arthur! There you are!" Regina cried, her smile faltering as she looked at Sarah. "What is this? Are you doing a charity photo op? You should have told us. I would have brought my publicist." She looked at Sarah's tattered bag with a moue of distaste. "Is that trash?" "Arthur, really. The smell in here is becoming quite pungent." Arthur stood up. He felt a cold rage he hadn't experienced in years. "The only thing pungent in this room, Regina, is your lack of empathy. Sarah is my guest. If you can't speak to her with respect, you can return to the party." Regina's face turned a mottled red. "You're choosing to sit with a beggar over the woman who is supposed to be your partner?" "I'm choosing a human being over a mannequin," Arthur replied. The mezzanine was silent except for the rhythmic, wet sound of Leo's breathing. Arthur had moved them to a private lounge behind the cafe, a room lined with leather books and thick Persian rugs. For Sarah, the luxury was suffocating. It felt like a dream she was destined to be kicked out of. A man in a charcoal overcoat entered, carrying a black medical bag. Dr. Aris had been the Sterling family's physician for 20 years. He was used to midnight calls for hangovers or exhaustion, but he stopped short when he saw the small, shivering child on the sofa. "Arthur, what is this?" the doctor asked, already reaching for his stethoscope. "A priority," Arthur said, standing by the door like a sentry. Sarah watched with her heart in her throat as Dr. Aris began the examination. He was gentle, but his face grew more somber with every second. He checked Leo's pulse, looked into his glazed eyes, and listened to his chest for a long time. "His lungs are filling with fluid," Dr. Aris whispered, turning to Arthur and Sarah. "It's bacterial pneumonia. His immune system is non-existent, likely from the cold and lack of proper nutrition. If you hadn't brought him in tonight—" He trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. Sarah let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with her cracked hands. I tried to keep him warm. I used every blanket I had." "I know you did," Arthur said, stepping toward her. He felt a desperate need to comfort her, but he didn't know how. He had spent his life managing assets, not hearts. "Doctor, what does he need?" "He needs high-dose antibiotics, a nebulizer, and constant monitoring in a sterile, warm environment," Dr. Aris replied. "I can stabilize him here for an hour, but he should be in a hospital." "No!" Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "If I go to the county hospital, they'll call social services. They'll see I'm homeless, and they'll take him away from me. I can't lose him. He's all I have left." Arthur looked at the terror in her eyes. He knew she was right. The system was designed to categorize, not to care. If Sarah entered a public ward, she would be labeled unfit by a bureaucrat who had never spent a night in the wind. "He stays here," Arthur said firmly. "I have a guest suite on the 55th floor. It's a private residence. We'll bring the medical equipment there. Dr. Aris, I'll pay whatever the premium is for private nursing, but no reports. Not tonight." "Arthur," the doctor warned, "you're bypassing a lot of legal protocols." "I'm the CFO of this building and this company." Arthur's voice was like steel. "I'll handle the protocols. Save the boy." As Dr. Aris began administering the first round of medicine, Sarah looked at Arthur. She looked past the expensive suit and the cold corporate exterior. "You're risking a lot for us." "Why?" Regina was right. "I am a nobody to your world." Arthur looked out at the Chicago skyline, the lights of the city shimmering like cold diamonds. "In my world, Sarah, everyone is somebody because of what they own. For the first time tonight, I want to help someone because of who they are. Now help the doctor. I have some calls to make." By 2 a.m., the 55th floor guest suite had been transformed. A portable oxygen concentrator hummed quietly in the corner of the master bedroom. Leo was buried under layers of down blankets, his skin finally beginning to lose that terrifying blue tint. Sarah sat in a plush armchair by the bed. She had been given a set of silk pajamas and a warm robe by Maria, the housekeeper. She felt like an alien in this environment. The air was perfectly filtered, the silence was absolute, and the fear of the next moment was, for the first time in a year, absent. A soft knock came at the door. Arthur entered, having changed into a casual sweater and slacks. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes matching hers. "He's sleeping deeply," Arthur said, looking at Leo. "The medicine is working," Sarah whispered. "Thank you, Arthur. Truly." He walked to the window. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the insurance company and the pre-existing condition. My company, we manage the logistics for those very firms. We help them optimize. I never realized that optimization meant leaving a child on a street corner." "It's not your fault," Sarah said, though a part of her wanted to scream that it was everyone's fault. "It is my fault if I know about it and do nothing," he countered. He turned to her, his expression intense. "I looked up your record. You worked for Miller & Associates. You handled their pro bono cases for 3 years. You were brilliant, Sarah. Your old boss wrote a letter of recommendation that was never sent because the firm folded." Sarah looked down at her hands. "That feels like a different life, a different woman." "It's still you," Arthur said, stepping closer. "The law hasn't changed. Your brain hasn't changed. Only your circumstances have." Before Sarah could respond, the silence was shattered by the sound of the suite's front door slamming open. Eleanor Sterling marched into the room, her face a mask of aristocratic fury. Behind her, Regina stood with her arms crossed, looking smug. "Arthur Sterling!" Eleanor hissed, her voice a whip crack in the quiet room. "I have just spent 3 hours apologizing to our guests because you disappeared with a stray. I find out you've moved them into the corporate suite. Have you lost your mind?" "Mother, keep your voice down. There is a sick child in the next room," Arthur said, his voice dangerously calm. "I don't care if there's a sick elephant in the next room," Eleanor snapped. "Regina's father is threatening to pull his support from the merger. The board is calling an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. You are destroying everything we've built for a moment of misplaced guilt." Regina stepped forward, her eyes scanning Sarah with pure venom. "Look at her, Arthur. She's already using your silk. How much did she ask for? I can write her a check right now to disappear. 10,000? 20? What's the price for a homeless mom to find a new corner to haunt?" Sarah stood up. She wasn't the broken woman from the street corner anymore. The warmth, the safety of her son, and the respect Arthur had shown her had reignited the fire in her soul. "I don't want your money, Regina," Sarah said, her voice steady and cold. "And I don't want your life. But if you speak about my son like he's a stray one more time, I will show you exactly what a mother who has lost everything is capable of." The room went dead silent. Even Eleanor blinked in surprise. Arthur felt a surge of pride so strong it startled him. He walked over and stood directly beside Sarah, his shoulder brushing hers. "Mother, Regina, get out," Arthur said. "Arthur, think about the company," Eleanor pleaded. "I am thinking about the company," Arthur replied. "I'm thinking it's time Sterling Grant had a CFO who cares about more than just the bottom line. Now leave, before I have security escort you out of your own building." As they left, fuming, Arthur turned to Sarah. He saw the adrenaline fade, replaced by a weary sadness. "They won't stop," Sarah whispered. "Neither will I," Arthur promised. The morning sun over Chicago was a cold, blinding white, reflecting off the ice on the river. Inside the Sterling Grant boardroom, the atmosphere was even more frigid. Arthur sat at the head of the mahogany table, facing 5 men and his mother. These were the titans of the industry, men who viewed human lives as data points on a ledger. "Arthur," began Mr. Henderson, the senior board member, his voice dripping with forced concern. "We've reviewed the security footage. You brought a person of no fixed address into a high-security corporate facility. You've used company funds for private medical care. This is a gross misappropriation of assets." "I used my personal discretionary fund, Henderson," Arthur countered, leaning forward. "And the person you're referring to is a qualified legal professional who was failed by the system we profit from." Eleanor slammed a folder onto the table. "Enough with the sentimentality. The senator called me this morning. Regina is humiliated. The merger with the Midwest Trade Lobby is on life support. They see you as unstable, Arthur. A CFO who makes decisions based on a sob story is a liability." "Is it a liability to have a conscience?" Arthur asked, his eyes scanning the room. "We spend millions on corporate social responsibility marketing. But when a real opportunity to save a life sits in our lobby, you call it a liability." "We are offering a solution," Henderson interrupted, sliding a legal document across the table. "A settlement. $50,000 for the woman, a place in a high-end shelter in a different ward, and a non-disclosure agreement. She leaves the building by noon, and she never speaks to the press about your connection." Arthur looked at the paper. It was a bribe disguised as charity. "And if she refuses?" "Then we will be forced to vote on your removal as CFO," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "Arthur, don't throw away a legacy for a woman you found in a doorway. Think of who you are." "I am thinking of who I was becoming," Arthur said, standing up. He didn't take the paper. "I will present your offer to Sarah, but I suggest you start looking at the bylaws, because I'm not going anywhere, and neither is she." Arthur returned to the guest suite, the settlement papers heavy in his hand. He found Sarah in the small dining area, She was wearing a simple borrowed sweater, her hair pulled back. She looked refreshed, but the anxiety in her eyes was sharp. Leo was in the bedroom, watching cartoons, his laughter a strange, beautiful sound in the sterile apartment. "They want me to leave, don't they?" Sarah asked before he could speak. Arthur sat across from her. He placed the document on the table. "The board is offering you $50,000. It's enough to get an apartment, a car, and a fresh start for Leo. The catch is a non-disclosure agreement. You'd have to leave today and never contact me or the company again." Sarah looked at the papers. For a woman who had counted pennies for a loaf of bread, $50,000 was an astronomical sum. It was safety. It was a future for her son. "And what happens to you if I take it?" she asked softly. "I stay CFO. The merger goes through. My mother is happy," Arthur said, his voice flat. "And if I don't take it? Then they try to fire me. They'll try to smear your name to justify my removal. It will be a fight, Sarah. A dirty, public fight." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the tiny people on the street below. She remembered the feeling of the wind. She remembered the way people looked through her as if she were made of glass. "All my life, I've tried to play by the rules," Sarah said. "I worked hard, I paid my taxes, I love my husband. And when it all fell apart, the rules didn't care. Now, these men want to pay me to disappear because I'm an inconvenience to their gold." She turned back to Arthur, her eyes burning with a fierce, quiet power. "If I take this money, I'm telling my son that our dignity has a price tag. I'm telling him that we should be ashamed of our struggle." She picked up the settlement papers and, without a moment's hesitation, tore them in half, then in quarters. She let the pieces fall onto the expensive carpet. "I don't want their silence money," she said. "I'd rather be back on that corner with my head held high than live in a house bought with my own disappearance." Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He had spent his life surrounded by people who would sell their souls for a fraction of that check. "I hoped you'd say that," Arthur said, a smile finally breaking through his tired face. "Because I have a better plan. Tonight is the Christmas Gala. It's the biggest social event of the year. Every board member, every investor, and every journalist in the city will be there." "What are you saying?" Sarah asked. "I'm saying that tonight you're not going to disappear," Arthur said, stepping closer and taking her hands. "You're going to be my guest of honor. We're going to show them that you aren't a liability. You're the reason this company needs to change. Are you ready to stop hiding, Sarah?" Sarah looked toward the bedroom where Leo was safe and warm. She looked at Arthur, the man who was willing to lose a kingdom for her truth. "I'm a paralegal, Arthur," she said with a small, determined smirk. "I know how to make an entrance." The afternoon before the gala was a calculated whirlwind. Arthur didn't just want Sarah to look beautiful, he wanted her to look undeniable. He bypassed the corporate stylists and called Chloe, a world-renowned designer known for her minimalist architectural elegance. "Don't turn her into a doll," Arthur instructed Chloe in the private dressing suite. "She's a survivor. I want her to look like the storm that's about to hit this city." As the stylists worked, Sarah sat in the chair, feeling the weight of the moment. They treated her skin with expensive oils, healing the cracks left by the Chicago wind. Her hair, once dull from malnutrition, was revived into a sleek chestnut wave. But the centerpiece was the dress, a deep, midnight emerald gown made of heavy silk. It had no sequins, no lace, just a cut so perfect it looked like it was molded to her soul. While Sarah prepared, Arthur was met in the hallway by his driver, Marcus. "Sir, a word," Marcus whispered. "I saw Regina's assistant in the security room. They were looking through the old archives, specifically your father's old files and the guest suite's logs. They're looking for dirt, sir." "Let them look," Arthur said, his jaw tight. "The only dirt in this building is under their fingernails." By 8 p.m., the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton was a sea of black ties and diamonds. The 10 women, the competitors, were all there, led by Regina, who wore a dress so bright it was blinding. They were whispering, confident that Sarah had been disposed of by the board. The master of ceremonies stood at the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, our CFO, Arthur Sterling." The doors at the top of the grand staircase opened. Arthur appeared, looking every bit the Titan. But then, he reached back and took the hand of the woman beside him. The room didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. Sarah stepped into the light. She wasn't wearing a single diamond. Her only accessory was her posture, back straight, eyes clear, and a grace that made the heiresses in the front row look like they were wearing costumes. "Is that her?" someone whispered. "The homeless woman? No. It can't be." Arthur led her down the stairs as the cameras flashed. He could feel Sarah's hand trembling slightly in his, but her grip was firm. They reached the floor, and immediately, Regina and Eleanor intercepted them, backed by the glare of the social media photographers. "Arthur, this is a mockery," Eleanor hissed, her face pale. "You are parading a tragedy in front of our investors." "No, Mother," Arthur said, loud enough for the nearby reporters to hear. "I'm introducing the most resilient woman I've ever met, and the newest voice of this company." The dinner was a battlefield of whispers. Regina, unable to contain her rage, stood up during the appetizers. She had a glass of red wine in one hand and a smartphone in the other. "A toast!" Regina shouted, her voice echoing off the gold-leafed ceiling. "To Arthur Sterling, for his creativity. It's amazing what a little soap and an expensive dress can do for a vagrant, isn't it?" A few people chuckled nervously. Sarah sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on Regina. "But let's talk about reality," Regina continued, stepping towards Sarah's chair. "Arthur, you told the board she's a legal professional. But my father's investigators found something else. 2 months ago, Sarah Miller was arrested for loitering and theft of a gallon of milk from a grocery store. Is this the woman we want representing Sterling Grant? A criminal?" The room gasped. Eleanor looked triumphant. This was the killing blow. Sarah stood up slowly. She didn't look at Regina. She looked at the entire room. "I did steal that milk," Sarah said, her voice steady and echoing through the silence. "My son hadn't eaten in 2 days. I had 4 cents in my pocket. I begged the manager. I offered to wash the windows. I offered to sweep the parking lot. He told me to get out or he'd call the police. So, when he turned his back, I took the milk. I ran back to the bridge where we were sleeping, and I watched my son drink it before the police found us." She took a step toward Regina. "You've never been hungry a day in your life, Regina. You've never had to choose between your dignity and your child's life. You think that arrest record is a mark of shame? To me, it's a mark of what I'm willing to do to keep my son alive. Can you say you've ever fought that hard for anything other than a seat at a table?" The silence that followed was heavy with shame. The rich women in the room looked down at their plates. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Arthur stood up and walked to the microphone at the head table. "Tonight was supposed to be about celebrating our profits," Arthur said. "But Sarah Miller just gave us a lesson in value. I am officially announcing the Sterling Grant Foundation for Urban Resilience. We are committing 20% of our annual bonuses, including mine, to ensure that no mother in this city has to steal milk to keep her child alive. And Sarah Miller will be the executive director, with full legal authority to overhaul our community outreach." The board members looked at each other. They saw the cameras. They saw the journalists frantically typing. They realized that if they fought this now, they would be the villains of the decade. Regina tried to speak, but her father, the senator, grabbed her arm and forced her to sit down. He knew when a battle was lost. Arthur walked over to Sarah, ignored the cameras, and took both of her hands. "You did it," he whispered. "No," she said, a tear finally escaping and rolling down her cheek. "We did it." The day after the gala, the snow fell differently. It wasn't the hostile, biting sleet of the previous week. It was a soft, silent blanket that seemed to hush the roar of Chicago. Inside the 55th floor suite, the air smelled of peppermint tea and the faint, sweet scent of a real balsam fir tree that Arthur had ordered to be delivered at dawn. Sarah woke up not to the sound of sirens or the shivering of her own limbs, but to the warmth of a sunlight-filled room. She sat up in the silk sheets, momentarily disoriented by the luxury. Then she remembered. She remembered the stage, the cameras, and the look in Arthur's eyes when he stood against the world for her. She walked into the living room and found Leo sitting on the floor. He wasn't coughing. His face was full, his eyes bright with the curiosity of a 5-year-old. He was staring at a pile of wrapped boxes under the tree. "Mommy, is this ours?" Leo whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make the vision evaporate. "It's a gift, Leo," Sarah said, kneeling beside him and pulling him into a hug. His heart beat strong against hers. A real gift. There was a soft knock, and Arthur entered. He wasn't wearing his suit. He wore a simple navy sweater and carried a tray of breakfast, pancakes, fresh fruit, and hot cocoa with extra marshmallows. "Merry Christmas, Sarah." "Merry Christmas, Leo," Arthur said. He looked younger today, the lines of corporate stress erased by a newfound peace. "Arthur, you've done too much," Sarah began, but he shook his head. "I haven't done enough," he replied. He handed her a leather folder. "This isn't a gift. It's your first contract. The foundation's bylaws are drafted. You have a salary, an office, and a mission. But before we talk about work, I want you to look at the second page." Sarah opened the folder. It was a lease agreement for an apartment in Lincoln Park. A quiet, safe neighborhood with a park across the street. The lease was in her name. The first year was fully paid. "Independence, Sarah," Arthur said softly. "I don't want you to stay because you have nowhere else to go. I want you to have a home that belongs to you, so that if you choose to be in my life, it's because you want to be." Sarah looked at the document, the ink blurring as her eyes filled with tears. For a year she had been a ghost. Now, she had a signature. She had a place on a map. She reached out and took Arthur's hand, her thumb brushing over his knuckles. "I don't need a year to know my choice, Arthur." The evening of Christmas at the Sterling estate in Lake Forest was a study in silence and tension. The mansion, a sprawling limestone fortress surrounded by ancient oaks weighted down by snow, felt like a museum of a dying era. Inside, the fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in, casting long, flickering shadows across the oil paintings of stern Sterling ancestors. Eleanor Sterling sat at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. She had spent decades curating a world of exclusivity, and tonight, that world was being breached by a woman who, only a week ago, was sleeping on cardboard. But Eleanor was nothing if not a survivor. She saw the way the wind was blowing. The press was calling Arthur a visionary of compassion, and Sarah was being hailed as the heroine of the high-rise. "The wine is a 1982 Bordeaux," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the clink of silverware. "My husband bought it the year Arthur was born. He said we should save it for a truly transformative occasion." She paused, her eyes flickering toward Sarah. "I suppose this qualifies." Sarah met her gaze. She didn't feel intimidated anymore. The fear of hunger is a powerful teacher. Once you have survived that, the judgment of a socialite loses its sting. "Transformation often comes from the places we least expect, Mrs. Sterling," Sarah replied. "Most people look at the city and see buildings. I look at the city and see the people the buildings were meant to protect." Beside her, Arthur reached under the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. He felt a profound sense of pride. He had spent his life trying to earn his mother's approval through balance sheets and mergers. Now, for the first time, he didn't care about her approval, and that was exactly when he finally earned her respect. As the night wound down, Arthur and Sarah walked out onto the stone terrace. The air was biting, but the view of Lake Michigan, a dark, vast mirror reflecting the winter stars, was breathtaking. "The board approved the first 3 shelters today," Arthur said, leaning against the cold stone railing. "They're not just giving beds, Sarah. We're giving legal aid, job placement, and dignity. We're calling it the Miller-Sterling Initiative. It's the first time in 10 years the board has voted unanimously on anything that didn't involve a dividend." "It's the start of something real," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "For the city, and for Leo." "And us?" Arthur asked, his voice low and intimate. "Is this real too? Or is it just the magic of the season?" Sarah turned to face him. The moonlight caught the silver in her eyes. "In my world, Arthur, we don't believe in magic. Magic is fickle. We believe in work. We believe in the choice to show up for someone when things are ugly. You showed up for me when I had nothing. I intend to show up for you now that we have everything. That's much more real than a fairy tale." He leaned in, and their kiss was a promise. a seal on a new life that had been forged in the coldest of nights. Inside, Leo lay fast asleep on a velvet sofa, a toy train clutched in his hand, breathing the air of a child who would never have to worry about the cold again. 6 months later, the snow had long since melted, replaced by the humid, vibrant energy of a Chicago summer. The city was alive with the sound of construction and the scent of lake water and blooming lilacs. Sarah Miller stood in the center of a renovated warehouse in the West Loop. The space was bright, filled with natural light and the hum of activity. This was the headquarters of the Miller Sterling Foundation. There were no mahogany tables or gold-plated elevators here. Instead, there were desks filled with young lawyers working on eviction defense and social workers coordinating health care for the displaced. A door opened, and a man walked in, looking lost and weary. He was holding a small girl's hand. Sarah recognized the look in his eyes, the hollow, haunted stare of someone who had just hit the bottom. I heard you help people like us," the man whispered. Sarah walked toward him, a warm, professional smile on her face. "We don't just help you," she said, handing him a glass of water. "We partner with you. My name is Sarah. Let's sit down and figure out your next step." From the glass-walled office in the back, Arthur watched her. He had stepped down from his daily role as CFO to become the foundation's chief strategist. He had traded his tuxedo for rolled-up sleeves and a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known was possible. His mother, Eleanor, had even joined the board, using her social connections to raise millions for the cause. She had discovered that being a philanthropist of the people was far more prestigious than being a senator's associate. At the end of the day, Arthur and Sarah walked out of the building together. Leo was waiting for them, older and taller, holding a soccer ball. He ran toward them, his laughter echoing against the brick walls of the neighborhood. "Ready for the park?" Arthur asked, catching Leo in the air. "Ready!" Leo cheered. As they walked toward Lincoln Park, they passed a luxury boutique, the same one Sarah had huddled in front of on that freezing Christmas Eve. A woman was sitting on the corner, a sign at her feet. Sarah stopped. She didn't just drop a bill into the woman's cup. She knelt down. She talked to her for 5 minutes. She gave her a card with the foundation's address and a name to ask for. "You can't save everyone, Sarah," Arthur said gently as she returned to his side. "Maybe not," Sarah said, taking his arm and looking at the sunset over the skyline. "But Arthur, you saved me. And because of that, I can try to save her. And she might save the next person. That's how you change a city, one choice at a time." The CFO and the woman from the street walked together, not as a fairy tale prince and a princess, but as two partners in a long, beautiful, and very real journey. The cold was gone, and in its place, they had built a warmth that would last for many winters to come.